on the hot seat once again as world patience runs very, very thin. Defense Secretary Robert Gates now saying he expects the U.S. and its allies will soon penalize Iran over its failure to live up to promises that it would open up its nuclear program to international inspection. Listen.
I think that you're going to see some significant additional sanctions imposed by the international community, assuming that the Iranians don't change course.
The Defense Secretary's comments just come a day after his boss laid down the law, arguing it's time for the world to step up and insist that nations like Iran do not, quote, game the system. Listen to this.
Those who claim to respect international law cannot avert their eyes when those laws are flouted. Those who care for their own security cannot ignore the danger of an arms race in the Middle East or East Asia. Those who seek peace cannot stand idly by as nations arm themselves for nuclear war.
Bear with me for a little contemporary history lesson here. Over the years, the UN Security Council has imposed 3 sets of sanctions on Iran. The first, freezing assets of Iranian individuals and companies linked with the nuclear program. And it also gave Iran 60 days to suspend uranium enrichment. That was a deadline, by the way, that Iran ignored. While another increased travel and financial limits on some Iranians. The U.S. also has its own set of sanctions, including a ban on most U.S.-Iran trade, orders that prevent U.S. companies from investing in Iranian oil and gas, and sanctions on some Iranian banks. Here to talk about the possibility of these new sanctions is John Bolton. He's a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, also a Fox News contributor. Great to have you back, sir.
Glad to be here.
All righty. Well, I mean, there's talking about more sanctions now. You know, this is something that some folks say is necessary and is a little too late. What do you think? Is this good news?
Well, obviously, a lot depends on what the sanctions are and who is going to support them. But I think the hard lesson here is that Iran is already so close to achieving a nuclear weapons capability that new sanctions, however strong, are not going to dissuade them from pursuing that capability. So there are a lot of questions that remain here. I think there's a lot of brave talk about new sanctions, but not the prospect of much action.
If you had to create a sort of strategy to deal with Iran, what sort of consequences would you want to implement?
Well, I think at this point you have to look at this, as you started out by saying correctly, in a historical context, and that is that the United States, Europe have been after Iran for 7 years now, nearly, to stop their nuclear program. The Europeans have been in negotiation for that entire period, and the threat of sanctions has been out there that entire period. It hasn't slowed Iran down in the slightest. So now, as they get very close to the end point of achieving this objective they've been pursuing for over 20 years, the idea that some new economic sanctions somehow will get them to change course, I think just doesn't bear out what we've seen. So I think we've got a very sad conclusion here, and that is that diplomacy or the threat of sanctions has failed, and that if you had to predict now, the outcome would be Iran is going to get nuclear weapons absent some really dramatic external development like the use of force.
The use of force by whom?
Well, one possibility is always the United States. Under the Obama administration, I don't see any chance that the U.S. would use force against Iran's nuclear program. So the question now becomes whether Israel makes the decision to use force, and I don't think they have much time to decide if, in fact, Russia supplies a very sophisticated new air defense system that Iran has already bought and paid for, the S-300s. That could limit Israel's possibility of the use of force very, very dramatically. So we're at a critical period here over the next maybe 6 months to see whether Iran succeeds in getting nuclear weapons or Israel uses force. I think sanctions play essentially no part in the scenario going forward.
Well, also with Israel saying that it would attack, possibly would attack Iran, Iran says, hey, look, we'd attack right back. All right, Ambassador Bolton, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it.